Okay, let's jump right into a deep dive today. We're looking at, well, a strategic chess match playing out globally, specifically how India responded to a truly devastating event.
Yeah, we're unpacking their multi-layered strategy after a major terror attack.
Hmm.
And we're focusing hard on this powerful diplomatic initiative they launched.
Right, one designed to really reshape a critical narrative, build global support. It's fascinating stuff.
There really is a study in how you use diplomacy right after a crisis hits. And the trigger event we're looking at, that was April 22nd, 2025, a significant terror attack.
And not just anywhere. Pahalgam, Kashmir, a place people often describe as stunningly beautiful, serene paradise almost.
Exactly. But on that day, it turned into an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
The information points to attackers from groups understood to be backed by Pakistan. Specifically, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-Taiba are named.
And the human cost. It was terrible.
Horrific. 26 lives lost. Just devastating.
So India's response wasn't just like one single move, was it? It was more complex.
So, not at all. It was two distinct prongs, very powerful ones. First, this immediate, decisive military action.
Okay.
And then, almost simultaneously, this massive global diplomatic effort.
And that's what we're really digging into, right? The military side, Operation Sindoor, was that initial forceful reaction?
Correct. But let's say the strategic long game, that was the diplomatic follow-up, Operation Outreach.
So our mission here is to unpack that. Operation Outreach. Understand the goals, how they actually pulled it off globally, its impact, and, the interesting strategic choices behind it all.
Precisely. Let's get into the fascinating details.
Okay, so starting point. That terrible day, April 22nd, 2025. Pahalgam. 26 people killed.
Yeah.
It was clearly a moment that needed a strong, unequivocal reaction from India.
And they delivered that. The initial reaction was military force, Operation Sindoor. It was fast and quite impactful by all accounts.
What do we know about the specifics?
Well, the details suggest 25 high-precision missile strikes.
Yeah.
And these weren't random. They targeted 9 specific identified terror hideouts,
Located where?
located both within Pakistan itself and in the area known as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, or POK.
Right, hitting targets deep inside those areas, that definitely sends a message. And the results. What was the reported outcome?
The numbers circulating indicate over 100 terrorists were eliminated. So it was a very clear, very hard military response.
And the name Sindoor, that's striking. It's not just a military code name, is it?
No, not at all. And that's incredibly poignant. Sindoor carries such deep cultural and emotional weight in India. It's the vermilion mark worn by married Hindu women.
So naming the operation Sindoor.
It directly linked the military action to the widows created by the terror attack in Pahalgam. It framed the strikes as, well, perhaps a form of justice or retribution for their loss. It added this profound, very personal layer of meaning.
Wow, that's powerful. So Operation Sindoor was the immediate war, the military answer. But like you said, India knew that couldn't be the whole story.
Exactly. That wasn't enough on its own. They needed the world to understand the why the roar. And they needed to shift the global conversation.
Enter Operation Outreach.
Precisely. The military action dealt with the immediate threat, you could say. But Operation Outreach, the diplomatic counteroffensive, that was aimed squarely at shaping the international narrative.
A global charm offensive is what some called it.
That term was used, yeah. But it was more than just charm. It was a really determined effort to take India's case directly to capitals around the world.
And the core message they were trying to land.
It was crystal clear, really. Zero tolerance for terrorism, especially terrorism originating from across its border. And, crucially, to directly highlight Pakistan's alleged role in supporting these groups.
So challenging that narrative head on.
Absolutely. Solidifying India's own stance and trying to change how the world saw the situation.
How do you even start to execute something like that on a global scale so quickly?
Well, they didn't just rely on existing ambassadors. They went big. They put together and sent out 7 high-level delegations. Think of them as special diplomatic envoys, tasked specifically with this mission.
7 distinct teams. Simultaneously, where did they go?
The scope was huge. These 7 teams visited a remarkable 33 global capitals.
33, wow.
Yeah, and this whole push started pretty quickly after the attack in Operation Sindoor, kicked off around May 7th, 2025.
33 capitals in what sounds like just a few weeks. That's a massive diplomatic undertaking. And the makeup of these teams. That's really interesting. It wasn't just foreign service officers, was it?
No, and that's one of the most strategically clever parts, I think. They
Sure.
were deliberately diverse. Yes, you had government officials, seasoned former diplomats bringing that experience, but critically,
Yes.
they included members of parliament from across India's political spectrum. We're talking BJP, the ruling party, sure, but also Congress, DMK, Shiv Sena, AMM, NCP, JDU, major opposition parties.
So like you said, a real masala dosa of Indian politics, bringing all those different viewpoints together. Why was that so vital for a global audience?
Because it showed unity. Globally, people see India's democracy as vibrant, maybe sometimes a bit chaotic, right, with all these parties.
Definitely.
So by sending figures from across that divide, they could demonstrate to world leaders.
Hmm.
Look, on this issue, this critical national security threat, we are united. Despite our domestic arguments, India speaks with one voice against terrorism and on Pakistan's alleged role.
That adds huge credibility, doesn't it?
Immense credibility. It wasn't just the government's line, it was India's line.
Okay, so let's talk about the list. 33 countries. That couldn't have been just pulling names out of a hat.
Oh, absolutely not. It was clearly a very calculated list.
Yeah.
Designed for maximum impact, serving multiple strategic aims.
Like who? Who are the key targets?
Well, you had the big hitters,
Yeah.
naturally, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the P5. If you want to shape global opinion, maybe lay groundwork for future action, you need them on board, or at least fully briefed.
Makes perfect sense.
Who else? Significant Gulf economies were on there. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, hugely important relationships for India energy, the large Indian diaspora, regional security, all crucial.
Right.
Then you had innovation hubs, Japan, Germany, reflecting India's growing focus on economic and tech partnerships.
Okay.
And ASEAN neighbors, too, vital for India's Act East policy and influence in Southeast Asia.
And you mentioned earlier even Latin American countries. That seems a bit further afield from the immediate trigger.
And that's where you see the clever multi-layered thinking, right? While the trigger was terrorism, these delegations weren't only talking terror.
Oh, okay.
Visiting places like Latin America, rich in minerals for things like EV batteries, which India needs for its future economic plans, shows they were also pitching India as a stable, reliable partner for trade, tech, investment.
So using the crisis as a platform for broader goals, too.
Exactly. Securing friends and future opportunities. It connected the immediate security concern to India's long-term vision that Viksit Bharat's plan to become a developed economy by 2047.
Very strategic. How did they prepare these diverse teams for such a whirlwind tour? They needed to be singing from the same hymn sheet, presumably.
Right. The Foreign Secretary, Vikram Misri, personally briefed all 7 delegations quite thoroughly. Made sure they had all the facts, the Pahalgam attack details, Operation Sindoor specifics, India's precise position on Pakistan's alleged role.
So a unified, informed voice was key.
Essential. And by May 21st, so just a few weeks after the initial attack, all 7 teams were out there, traveling, engaging.
What were they actually doing in these capitals? What did the engagement look like?
It was a real mix. High-level meetings, of course, presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, but also engaging influential think tanks, trying to shape the policy discussions.
Media, too.
Definitely interacting with local and international media to get India's side of the story out there. And, very importantly, rallying the Indian diaspora.
Ah, yes, the diaspora. Often a powerful force multiplier.
Huge. They could be incredibly effective advocates and amplifiers for India's message within those countries.
Do we have any specific examples of the impact they made?
We do. For instance, in Johannesburg, South Africa, one team held this packed event, about 350 people, expats and locals, and the purpose was explicitly to call out Pakistan's alleged role in sponsoring terror. So, quite public.
Not just quiet diplomacy, then.
Not entirely, and we saw positive signals from governments, too. Reports mentioned Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, Adel al-Jubeir, giving a sort of informal thumbs up to India's anti-terror stance.
Yeah.
France, already a strong strategic partner, publicly doubled down on its solidarity.
Okay. And how did Pakistan react to this massive, coordinated Indian diplomatic blitz?
Well, this is where the contrast becomes really stark. And maybe that was part of India's strategy, too.
How so?
While India sent 7 delegations hitting 33 capitals, Pakistan reportedly dispatched only 2 delegations. Just 2.
2 versus 7. 33 capitals versus... How many did Pakistan cover?
The reports don't specify the exact number Pakistan covered, but the disparity in the number of teams, sent out 7 versus 2, highlights a huge difference in the scale and intensity of the diplomatic effort.
That difference alone must have registered globally.
You'd have to think so. It underlined how much more diplomatic resource and, frankly, political will India was putting behind this issue compared to Pakistan's response.
Let's circle back to that bipartisan element again, including opposition leaders. You said it added credibility, but can we emphasize that impact a bit more?
It really was fundamental. Think about it. In a world watching India's, let's face it, often noisy domestic politics, seeing this unified front on national security, that's incredibly powerful.
It cuts through the noise.
Precisely. Seeing figures like Shashi Tharoor from Congress, Kanamozi from DMK, Supriya Sule from NCP, Asaduddin Owaisi from AMM, Ghulam Nabi Azad, Sama Khurshid, all respected, often critical voices traveling alongside ruling party members like Ravi Shankar Prasad, Baijan Panda, others too, Sanjay Haas, Shrikant Shinde.
That list itself tells a story.
It absolutely does. It signals serious cross-party buy-in. It makes it much harder for other countries to dismiss this as just, the current government's agenda.
It frames it as India's national stance.
Exactly. Prime Minister Modi himself reportedly acknowledged this afterwards. He apparently said something like, sending opposition leaders sends a big message. And figures like Tharoor could then effectively highlight the contrast with Pakistan's minimal effort, adding weight because it came from an opposition voice.
And the External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar.
He framed the whole outreach very clearly as India taking a strong stance against Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. The messaging was consistent across the board.
And we touched on the broader goals, the economic pitch woven in. How did they balance that?
It seems they weren't just presenting dossiers on terrorism, they were actively selling the India story. Stable, peace-loving, focused on growth, open for business.
Laying groundwork for the future.
Absolutely. Talking trade, tech collaboration, energy deals. These visits were reactive to the crisis, yes, but also proactive steps towards building the international partnerships needed for that long-term Viksit Bharat's vision, securing the future while dealing with the present threat.
Okay, so by mid-June 2025, the outreach is starting to wind down. What was the overall sense of the reception in those 33 capitals?
Largely positive, based on the available reports. We mentioned South Africa hailing the zero-tolerance stance, France reaffirming solidarity. That Saudi social media post framing India as an anti-terrorism advocate was quite significant messaging from Riyadh.
And the diaspora effect.
Definitely seemed successful in amplifying the message locally, generating buzz and support within many countries.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, right? There were challenges, criticism.
No, absolutely not. And it's important to acknowledge those. On the military front, remember Operation Sindoor wasn't without consequences. Pakistan did launch counterattacks, reportedly hitting some Indian cities.
And there were losses during Operation Sindoor itself.
Yes, there were acknowledgments later of combat jet losses on the Indian side. This actually led to some pushback domestically.
Right, the transparency issue came up.
It did. The Chief of Defense Staff, Gen. Anil Chauhan, confirmed the losses publicly. This drew criticism, notably from the Congress Party.
What was their argument?
That information on military losses should perhaps have been shared first in an all-party meeting reflecting that bipartisan spirit shown in the delegations rather than coming out publicly later. It raised questions about the government's communication strategy around the military side of things.
Understandable. And internationally, did everyone fully buy in?
Realistically, probably not entirely. While 33 countries engaged, you have to assume not all offered concrete commitments, like pushing for sanctions on Pakistan. Some responses were likely polite diplomatic acknowledgments rather than firm, actionable support. Getting 33 countries to actively align on such a complex issue is always a tall order.
True. Despite those hurdles, though, did Operation Outreach achieve that core goal? Diplomatically isolating Pakistan, or at least shifting the narrative?
Well, if you look at the sheer contrast in effort, 7 teams, 33 capitals for India versus just 2 teams for Pakistan, the optics alone suggest India significantly outmaneuvered Pakistan on the diplomatic front.
Drawing a global contrast.
Exactly. India's narrative, framing Pakistan as a state linked to terror factories, definitely got significant international airtime and seemed to gain traction. Even if it didn't immediately translate into, say, UN sanctions, it likely shaped perceptions in many capitals.
And this fits into a bigger picture of India's role in the world, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This kind of diplomatic assertiveness is happening against the backdrop of India's rising economic power. As India heads towards potentially being the world's 3rd largest economy by 2030, countries are increasingly seeing alignment with India as strategically important.
Hedging their bets, maybe.
Placing their bets, perhaps. Operation Outreach is a really clear example of India's evolving diplomatic posture. moving beyond, say, traditional non-alignment towards more proactive, assertive engagement on the world stage.
It really feels like a shift from, India's historical role, sometimes perceived in global affairs.
A huge shift. You mentioned the historical comparison. Think back to Versailles in 1919. India was there, yes, but largely seen, maybe unfairly, as a sort of British lapdog cameo, as one source put it.
Right.
Fast forward to 2025. The picture's completely different. India is increasingly seen as a nation capable of calling the shots, defining and defending its interests forcefully. We saw glimpses of this during its G20 presidency, too, leading from the front.
And balancing different roles simultaneously?
Yes, that's key. Positioning itself as a voice of the global south, advocating for developing nations, while at the same time deepening strategic partnerships with the global north, particularly the West. It's like a complex, sophisticated diplomatic balancing act they're performing.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the positives and the strategic wins, but let's make sure we properly cover the criticisms that came up in the sources regarding Operation Outreach itself, for balance.
Absolutely crucial. So, as we touched upon, one line of criticism was about optics versus substance. The argument that this huge, impressive outreach might have been more about generating positive headlines, maybe shoring up domestic support, than achieving concrete international outcomes like sanctions against Pakistan.
Getting polite nods versus real action.
Exactly. Getting affirmation is one thing. Translating it into unified international pressure or punitive measures is a much heavier lift.
Were there concerns about the very strong focus on terrorism itself?
Yes, some observers raised the point that hammering the terrorism angle so hard, and specifically naming Pakistan so publicly, could potentially alienate some neighboring countries.
Why?
Because not all neighbors might share the exact same view of Pakistan, or they might have their own complex relationships and balancing acts to maintain. Very sharp single-issue diplomacy can sometimes complicate broader regional dynamics. It requires careful navigation.
And that transparency issue around the military losses ties back in here too, right?
It does. The domestic criticism about how the jet losses were communicated, the call from the Congress Party for a defense review, it all underscores that military actions need strong political and diplomatic support, and that includes clear communication at home.
Public trust matters.
Immensely. The effectiveness of your external diplomacy is always linked to your internal political situation and credibility. And of course, we can't ignore India's often polarized media landscape in all this. It amplified both the government's successes and the criticisms, shaping public perception on all sides.
Okay, so pulling all of this together, the strategy, the execution, the wins, the challenges, the critiques, what's the main takeaway from Operation Outreach?
I think it stands as a really significant example of modern proactive statecraft. It demonstrated India's capacity, and maybe more importantly, its willingness to respond assertively to a major security crisis. Not just with military force, but by taking its narrative directly to the world.
Transforming tragedy into a global conversation.
Right. Trying to shape that conversation around terrorism and state accountability, and doing it in a very visible, high-profile way.
And that bipartisan element was really a masterstroke, it seems.
It was incredibly powerful. Presenting that united front with prominent opposition figures on board gave the entire effort a layer of credibility it might not have had otherwise. So despite maybe some minor setbacks or debates about its ultimate tangible impact,
The scale itself was the message.
the scale was definitely part of the message. Engaging 33 capitals with high-level teams right after a crisis, that sent a clear signal about India's intentions and its readiness to play a major role on the global stage.
So for you listening, why should you care about this deep dive into Operation Outreach? What's the relevance?
Well, because it's a real-world case study of how nations are grappling with complex threats today. It shows a major country actively projecting its power, its values, its narrative onto the global stage. It's a story about strategic thinking, about linking security needs with economic ambitions, and about building the kind of international relationships that are vital for stability and growth in, let's face it, a pretty turbulent world.
Proactive diplomacy in action.
Exactly that. It's not just reacting, it's trying to shape the environment. It shows the multiple dimensions, military, economic, diplomatic, all have to work together.
It really does. Okay, thinking about everything we've unpacked, the bold strategy, the global reach, the bipartisan aspect, the reception, but also the questions raised, here's something maybe to mull over. As India continues its rapid economic rise, aiming for that top 3 spot globally, how will it keep balancing its undeniable security needs, like responding decisively to terrorism, with those ambitious goals for global economic leadership and deeper partnerships? Can you be both a hard-nosed security actor and a globally embraced economic partner simultaneously all the time?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And maybe what are the long-term effects of this kind of focused, high-intensity, multi-party diplomatic push? Does it build lasting goodwill, or can it sometimes create friction? How does it really shift a nation's standing and its key relationships over time?
Yeah, lots to think about there. The ripples from an event like this and the response can last for years.
Definitely food for thought.